You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Dr. Marc Milstein. He's the author of The Age-Proof Brain, New Strategies to Improve Memory, Protect Immunity, and Fight Off Dementia. So we're going to talk about that book and his past and his current work. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, if you can, just tell listeners a bit about your background, how you came to write this book, and concern yourself with the health of people's brains.
Yeah, definitely. So I started out as a researcher, a scientist. I was part of a group at UCLA that was actually studying breast cancer. And what was discovered at the time is that something or a protein involved in breast cancer was also involved in learning and memory. And at the time, that was really interesting that something in one part of the body or a specific protein that was involved in cancer was also involved in a different part of the body in learning and memory. And just around that time, our understanding of brain science was really, I would say, just like really exploding in terms of just really finding out how the brain works. I mean, of course, we're still learning, but it was really a turning point in terms of how things were working in the brain and then how that led to really actionable solutions to, for example, improve sleep or memory or manage stress. So I started focusing much more on brain health, and there's just like a real dire need to take all these amazing breakthroughs and just break it down in a way that is understandable and usable. And so that combined with some personal history that I talk about in the book in the very beginning about I had some family members that suffered from memory loss, dementia, Alzheimer's. So just that was really a key part of why I wrote the book, and just really trying to get this information out to people that there are really things that we can do to protect our brain day to day and long term.
Have you spent a lot of time working on your brain, or have you really spent it on helping other people? And what have you noticed?
Yeah, so
an improvement have you seen in yourself, or maybe an example you could think of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that I think that was part of what really drove my interest was that, for example, I wasn't naturally the best sleeper, and as we learned how important sleep was, really what's happening in the brain and how critical it is. And then also understanding, oh, wow, there's things based upon how our brain works that can really help sleep. That was really part of, I would say, a big driving force in my interest. So I would say I use these things. I need these things more than anybody. And I use them every day and the days that I don't use them, like, for example, I'll just give the quick tip is that something that we now understand is that you actually prepare for every night's sleep in the morning. You have this clock in your brain called a brain clock, or your suprachiasmatic nucleus. And it's actually, the discovery of it actually won the Nobel Prize pretty recently, but it's like a countdown timer to when you're going to fall asleep. And you start the countdown by getting outside in natural light in the morning, like within about a half hour of getting up, just like 10 minutes of getting outside helps you fall asleep at night. And I found for myself, and as I speak about this, and I get a lot of feedback, that little simple tip that seems like nothing. It seems like, oh yeah, a little bit of morning light, but we live in a world where, it's easy to either stay home or work from home or commute to an office in which you're not getting outside that much. And so that little tip of a little bit more daylight in the morning or outside time, is really optimal in starting this countdown to help you fall asleep at night. So that's just one example of many of things that I've taken and used and I find are very helpful.
Well, why does that tip help? Because it entrains your brain to know, okay, it's day, and then clocks start being set for later, so you're able to fall asleep better?
Yeah, so interestingly, this brain clock or the suprachiasmatic nucleus, it's part of your circadian rhythm. So it's reset every day. So you actually basically, by getting outside, you start this countdown and to when you're going to fall asleep at night. And what's interesting about it is it doesn't just play a role in sleep, this brain clock. We now understand it's like a master regulator. It's like a conductor to a symphony orchestra. And it also plays a role in mood. That's why we know that like seasonal affective disorder where there's less light in certain parts of the world during certain times of the year, people have a greater increased risk of issues with mood or higher risk of depression. Of course, not the only factor, but we realize that light plays a role, and then also plays a role in metabolism. So it's interesting that these little things that, they're not the whole picture, but they're a piece of the puzzle, and they can be really, really helpful.
What are some other aspects of the, I don't know if you call it a brain protocol, or, what are some of the highlights of the protocol that you recommend for people?
Yeah. Another thing that's important is walking. I mean, I try to highlight when I talk and in the book is, nobody wants to make major changes. Most people are like, what's the smallest thing that has the biggest impact? And besides the morning light, and this is something you can combine with the morning light, is that taking a walk. There's these interesting studies that show that walking for about 30 minutes a day lowers the risk of memory loss. So I should put in perspective that we now know that based upon key lifestyle factors, one can lower their risk of dementia, Alzheimer's, memory loss by about 30 to 60%, which is a really big step forward in our understanding of the impact of lifestyle on brain health. And so, optimizing your sleep is one of those. And that's important because we can talk about why that is. There's something that's happening during sleep. But when we talk about, another tip besides sleep, this walking tip lowers risk of memory loss by about 60%, lowers risk of dementia. And people are like, well, why, like just walking? But we now know that when we walk, we release a factor in our brain called BDNF. And it's a factor that really keeps our brain cells healthy, and it keeps them kind of more youthful. And that's really another big take-home message of the book, is that we clearly see now that you can make your brain essentially like slow down the aging process of it. Your brain's age doesn't have to be your age. And besides sleep, this 30 minutes of walking, it doesn't have to all be done at the same time. But in a world where it's another thing that can easily be overlooked, and we realize, wait, I'm not walking as much as I used to be, or as much as I could be. And then something that's really simple and practical within that 30 minutes of walking is that there's these really fascinating studies that show that like getting your heart rate up, like a brisk walk, something as simple as a brisk walk for like 6 to 10 minutes. Also, people significantly perform better on like memory tests. And we clearly see this in all these multiple studies that the pace of your walking, you don't have to power walk everywhere you go, but a little bit of a faster gait or walking pace within that 30 minutes for about 6 to 10 minutes is something else that has this boost for memory. So, our brain is tied to our walking and our balance and all these things. So yeah, another quick tip there.
How long is it boost for?
So there's all these different studies, but there's studies that have shown that like within doing getting your heart rate up for a few minutes, people score better on a memory test like within a few hours, a few hours span after their heart rate is up. And then also we see this protection cumulative long term. So that's pretty interesting.
I know after I exercise somewhat heavily, I'm clearer and better able to get work done and think for, maybe like an hour or two. Not that I fall off after that too much, but that's probably the peak time. So do you have that suggestion for people that, after the exercise, they should work maybe on the most, thought requiring work they have, or the most brain power intensive work they have?
Yeah. So I find that I use that myself as after like in the morning when I take a walk, I try to get some work done. And then when I notice that a few hours later, my brain is getting tired, to get the second part of the day as like another I would say second wind of brain optimization or function, is I'd exercise. And I find that that's very helpful in giving me like a fresh start on another few hours of activity, brain activity.
That's good. Okay. So along the way in helping people, what are some of the critical elements you found in being able to help people with their brains? And if someone's already in a poor state, they feel like they're forgetting names pretty frequently, or they actually have been diagnosed with, let's say, some early dementia. Is it too late? What can they do? Do you have protocols for that kind of thing?
Yeah. So we have all these hopeful insights now, that there's studies like, for example, out of Cornell that have come out recently that have found that if we can catch memory loss early stages. So the first thing is that there's many things that can cause memory loss or memory dysfunction. So the first thing is we want to figure out what's going on. Is it simply, we're overwhelmed, we're distracted? Because that is a part of it. Like we live in a world where there's just so much going on, that part of it is that we're just, we're multitasking and we're just doing too much, and we're not realizing that that's causing some of our memory issues. If it's beyond that, and that's not a key part of it, then we actually see that by these essentially interventions, like multiple step interventions, combinational approaches. So it's like optimizing people's diet, getting them to exercise, have them learn new things, treat some underlying conditions that seem disconnected but really do play a role in brain health, that are really common and often overlooked. And putting together this sort of like comprehensive approach, we do see that if you can catch memory loss early, you can, in some cases, reverse it, and in some cases, significantly slow down its progression. So even a few years ago, we couldn't say that, and now we have evidence that can happen, which is really hopeful.
Well, what are some conditions that may or may not, are associated with future brain problems that people don't realize are associated?
Yeah, I was just actually reviewing some studies just this morning, and something that it's actually in my book, but it was a new study that just brings more evidence to this idea, is that somebody's blood pressure in their 30s impacts their brain health in their 70s. And we see these patterns over and over again, that things that are like memory loss is something that takes oftentimes 10, 20, 30, 40 years to develop. So it's the roots of things that are happening years before. Blood pressure is one of them. And, knowing what your blood pressure is, trying to think about keeping it to like 110/70 or 110/80. And we have such good treatments for blood pressure that it's something that we would say like, oh, let's leverage that. Let's use that to our advantage so we can protect the brain long term. Another example is just heart health in general plays a big role in memory loss. Most people that have memory loss have some heart issue because the heart is just critical for supplying blood and oxygen and nutrients to the brain. Diabetes, 50% of our population either has prediabetes or diabetes. Many people don't know they have diabetes or prediabetes, and it's, besides age, our single greatest risk factor for developing memory loss or Alzheimer's or dementia, because diabetes and Alzheimer's actually have very similar underlying mechanisms. And we now know that brain health is related to metabolism. And so it's another example where if we effectively treat diabetes, the risk of that increased risk of dementia or memory loss goes down significantly. In some cases, goes all the way back down to like the risk disappears. So that's just two examples of where we see conditions where, the theme of the book is we have really good treatments for things that are often overlooked that can impact your brain health. We just want to take advantage of them, leverage them, and do everything we can to lower risk to try to push odds in people's favor.
Well, in regards to the blood pressure issue, it's not just that someone has blood pressure problems in their 30s, that continues all the way through their 70s, and that's why they have a problem?
Yeah, so it definitely, it's compounding. But what we see is that if somebody has blood pressure issues in their 30s and you treat it effectively, then they have a protection of for their brain health. They have a lower risk. Now, if starting in their 30s, if they have high blood pressure, issues with blood pressure, that increases the risk down the road. So it's not something that's like, oh, it's just a year or, a few months ahead of time we're starting to see dysfunction. It's just like so much longer than we thought, which is on one hand hopeful because it says like, wait, we can identify these things. People can get their blood pressure and you can in the pharmacy, and they can be on. There's all these, things people can do now to treat something that is helpful for their brain on top of just being important for their overall health.
But how do you know it'll help someone 40 years later? I highly doubt there's longitudinal studies that go that long.
Yeah, there are. So that was the study that I was reading today, was they actually have done these things. Yes, amazing. Yeah, they've done these studies where they track people.
Okay. So I don't know, what are there different levels of optimization people can do? Let's say someone just wants, someone that would normally use nootropics and wants to maximize their brain health versus someone that's having a problem remembering names and just wants to get their brain health back to an earlier state in their life or normal. What are some of the protocols that you've discussed in your book?
Yeah. So if you're just thinking about like day-to-day memory, there's a whole chapter there on like, how do I remember people's names? How do I remember where I put my keys or park my car or these things that are actually normal. It's normal to have those sort of like memory issues moment to moment. But, if they're happening with increasing frequency, they're happening all the time, and we want to figure out what's going on. We no longer want to say, oh, significant memory loss is a normal part of aging. Because a few years ago, that was sort of the way people communicated about this. They just said, oh, that's just part of aging. People lose their memory. But we now know that shouldn't be happening. There's things that we can do. Now, again, it's okay to have, forget an appointment here or there, or forget somebody's name. That's all normal. But if you want to just think about what are the things that you can do to lessen those incidences of happening, we've learned so much about how the brain works. And we've also learned from memory champions, who are people who actually compete in memory competitions. And what's interesting is they tap into all these really kind of fun things about how our brain works in order to optimize their memory. And one thing that it's important to be aware of is that your brain doesn't really want to remember most things. It's constantly filtering things out because there's just so much information hitting your brain. So there's some like things that you can do to pass what we would say like as a threshold of, oh, that's something that my brain is going to remember. And so like just a quick tip on this is that in order for your brain to remember information, it's much more likely to remember information if it's like emotional, if it's scary, if it's silly, if it's funny. Like if you just think about information that is emotional, very likely if you think about your ancestors, and our brain hasn't changed in a very long time. We have the same brain people had quite a long time ago. Information that's emotional gets tagged by certain chemicals in the brain when you make the memory, when you make basically your brain cells make a synaptic connection that houses the memory. And we now know that emotional memories are tagged, so your brain goes, remember this. And this is important. This could be based on, this could help you survive, especially, if you think about evolutionarily, those things were important as opposed to like the password for your that account that you can't remember. If it's a random string of numbers or letters, your brain probably isn't going to remember it because it's not important evolutionarily. But your brain, if it's emotional, it is. So like a really simple trick is just practice things that you have to remember by making them silly, funny, scary if you want to go that route. Like you want to remember someone's name, like silly rhymes. I know this stuff sounds ridiculous, but if you look at memory champions and you look at how the brain works, like taking an extra second or two and being like, I'm going to make this memory, not just the memory, but I'm going to build upon it and give some emotion to it, your brain is much more likely to remember it. So that's just one like really simple tip. Takes an extra few seconds, but can save you a lot of time remembering things.
Okay. That makes sense. For someone, let's say in their 40s, they're starting to forget names and places. It takes them a second or two to get a name into their head. I've heard that commonly. I've experienced it. What do you think is going on there? I mean, I know it depends on the person, but
in general, obviously there's many different reasons for that, as you stated, but in terms of just like a general principle is that in order for you to remember information and recall it, there's a part of your brain called the hippocampus. And what's interesting is that we now know that this part of the brain really likes you to focus on information uninterrupted for about 7 to 10 seconds. And what's happening is that is another threshold that tells your brain, oh, this information is important. And when you learn something or you see something, it first goes essentially to the hippocampus. It's like a waiting room for the brain. And then the rest of your brain decides, is this information worth it? Or is this a complete waste of my time? Because if it's worth it, it leaves the hippocampus and it's transferred on to other parts of the brain involved in long-term memory. You're going to store it and remember it. If it's not worth it, your brain like kind of just filters it out. And we're doing this all day long because there's just so much information. So, if you're having trouble remembering a name or you're having trouble, you're wondering like, information's not sticking like it used to. As we get a little bit older, multitasking, distractions, they really do interfere with our brain's ability to take information from the hippocampus and transfer it on. So a really simple tip that, again, these things sound silly, but if you practice it, people are often amazed how beneficial it is that if you want to remember someone's name, you want to remember something, like say, okay, I'm going to eliminate all distraction. I'm going to put my phone down, put it down, the screen or the two screens that I'm looking at, and I'm just going to focus on this and nothing but this for the next 7 to 10 seconds. People are surprised how much more they remember. Because if you really think about it, we live in a world where often we don't spend 2 seconds remembering where we parked our car, put our keys. We're often just on to the next, or we're multitasking. If you've had that experience where you're doing something, you turn, you check your phone, you go back, and you're like, wait, what was I just doing? It's that like constant tasking that's challenging. So a little bit slowing down can be really helpful.
Yeah, I'm always trying to increase my attention span. I feel like it's been fragmented by smartphone use. And I don't use social media, but still, even just using the smartphone, it feels like it's fragmented it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so brain scientists have been hired to design the smartphone so that it's constantly tugging at us, at our brain saying, check me. And so it's being aware of that and like finding times to like put it away and take a break from it can be helpful in getting that attention back.
In younger people, are they able to multitask, or is no one able to multitask, or they can just hide it better, or their brain can accommodate it better? What's your thoughts there?
It depends upon the person, but in general, when we're younger, we are better able to multitask in some ways. So, for example, like driving, we shouldn't be multitasking while driving really at any age, but we see that in these studies, that's dangerous. But, going from task to task when we're younger, people tend to be better at like what's called their working memory, which is like almost like a scratch pad in your brain, like a piece of paper where you kind of hold information and then you refer back to it. As we get a little bit older, that diminishes, and we can definitely improve upon it by practicing, but you kind of have to practice for most people. We have to do these tricks that we're talking about where you make information, you focus on it a little bit longer, or you make it more emotional, or some other tricks too. But that is something that we see as we get older diminishes. But there's other parts of memory that as we get older stay very steady and strong. Our ability to learn and remember is in general, if we take time to do it, seems to be pretty constant throughout our lifetime if we practice it. But that ability to jump between tasks does diminish in most people.
Have you studied people that are active lifelong learners, and how neuroprotective is that? Or how good for the brain is that?
Yeah, I mean, there are these studies, they call them super agers. And a super ager is a person who is in their 70s, 80s, 90s, up to 100, and they have the memory of someone who's decades younger when you test them on memory tests. And some of them, astoundingly, have the memory of someone who's 25 years old. And their secrets are basically all the things we're talking about. But one thing that you just mentioned that they consistently seem to prioritize, many of them prioritize, is lifelong learning. And we see clearly how important that is, that there's something very different in the brain to reviewing information that you already know, which can be good. Like if you're learning a song on the piano and you keep practicing the same song over and over again, there's benefits to that. You get better at it, which is good, or practicing a sport, some specific aspect of a sport. But learning something new, outside of your field of expertise, is one of the best things you can do for your brain, because it's not only forcing your brain to make new connections, which your memories are stored in. As we get older, we just naturally lose some connections. So making new ones by learning new things, lifelong learning, is just so critically important. But also we realize that there's some chemicals that are released in the brain when we learn new things that actually keep the brain more youthful. This chemical called norepinephrine. But the short answer that I'll sum up is, yes, learning new things in multiple different ways is one of the best things you can do for your brain to protect it long term.
Anyone that that's gone to extremes in terms of optimizing their brain, in a healthy way, not screwing themselves up, but that has done it and just seen market improvement? And if so, what kind of improvement was it?
I would say that extremes, is something that we're more concerned about, because anything going overboard, too much of people going too much exercise can lead to inflammation, which is another issue. So I would say a balanced approach is where we see a lot of benefit in terms of it doesn't have to be extreme, and so being aware that we want to manage our stress. Stress is a key part of this. Our immune system, we want to keep it balanced. That's another key part of it. So I would say that a moderate, balanced approach, and really trying to find activities that hit more than one thing. So if we just think about things we've talked about, we talked about walking, we talked about morning light. So taking a walk in the morning is something where you're oh, there's two things I can combine in a really moderate, sensible approach. That's where we really see more benefit.
Last question. What about nootropics? Brain boosting type substances. What's your experience and thoughts on them? Do they work? Are they harmful?
I think they fall in the category of, we just need more research. There's definitely things there's definitely marketing that jumps ahead of the science. And we want to be careful about that. Anytime somebody is taking something that's in a supplement form, we want to really make sure that they need it. It's not interfering with other medications they could be taking, and that they're just being careful, because when it comes to supplements, we really don't have strong evidence that there's anything that you can take that is really, we could point to a really strong study or multiple studies where we say, okay, this is really beneficial. Instead, it's people, they say it helps them, or it's small studies funded by the companies that make these medications, or these supplements, I should say. So I just want to be careful. We don't see, hopefully someday there will be something that we can point to. But at this point, we're still saying that, the lifestyle factors, the diet is critically important. supplements can be used, but we just want to be careful that they can do harm too. We just want to be careful that they're being used really responsibly and under the care of a physician, because there can be negative consequences.
So there's no clear signal and possibly a negative signal that nootropics have any effect? Or is it more long-term use of them? Or
it's an area that is, the reason why it's murky and, as you said, a mess is because these things aren't regulated in terms of quality of, we know what's in them, we can be confident. The studies are just, we need studies there. They're just not done. They're not done in a way that is large scale, and that they're, double blind, placebo controlled, things that we get really strong evidence from. There's definitely things that we're like, oh, that's interesting, and there's emerging evidence there. We need more studies, but there's nothing that I wish we could say, we just, everybody take this, but we're just not at that point.
Okay. Well, very good. Can you restate the name of your book? And I guess it's available on Amazon, everywhere books are sold, or where can we get more info?
The book is called The Age-Proof Brain, and it's really just simple, practical strategies rooted in brain science that can really, I would just say, get the best of your brain each day, boost memory, focus, and productivity, and protect it years down the road. And it's, very empowering. It's not like a boring science book. It's filled with, just like, oh, wow, I could do that. I can do those things. And I see why scientifically that's helpful.
Okay. Well, very good, Marc. Thank you for coming on the podcast and explaining all this. And I'm sure most everyone wants to improve their brain function. So it sounds like a very promising thing that you've written about. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.